Welcome to this webinar hosted by FoRB Women's Alliance on International Standards of Freedom of Religion or Belief. I'd like to turn it over to my co-founder, Judith Golub, who will introduce herself and our guest today.
Thank you. That was Luann Sabatier, one of the co-founders with me of FoRB's Women's Alliance, along with Farinaz Ishbahani. I'm so happy and pleased to have Elizabeth Cassidy join our webinar today. Elizabeth is Director of Research and Policy at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, UCIRF. Elizabeth oversees UCIRF's research and publications and the development and promotion of UCIRF's policy recommendations. She is an expert on international standards for FoRB, that's freedom of religion or belief, an internationally recognized right. We are so pleased to have her with us today. This webinar will highlight provisions in international law and in other international members, and why it is important that members of civil society and others know about these standards. Elizabeth will discuss these standards along with concrete examples of when and where the violations of these standards took place and actions that advocates and others have taken using these standards to identify violations and call out the violators. Elizabeth, I have so many questions to ask you. I want to start with one. Why is it important for advocates and others to know about these standards? Why does it matter?
Judy, thanks. That's a great question. And first, thanks so much for inviting me to do this webinar today. I'm really happy to be here to do this for Women's Alliance. So it's a really important question. Why do these standards matter for those advocating for freedom of religion or belief internationally? And the first reason is because these are international standards. So these are standards that have been negotiated in the international system by governments and agreed to or signed onto by governments. So they are universal. They are not the standards that only one country is subject to or only some country is subject to. They are for everyone. For advocacy purposes, these standards are useful to respond to governments that violate religious freedom, to respond to their justifications for why they say they're not violating religious freedom. This is the ways to point out that they are. The standards are also very important to provide information and seek help and advocacy from international organizations that are working on human rights issues, from governments that are promoting religious freedom, from other entities that work on international religious freedom issues like the UCIRF, like the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief. The standards are also important to know for media advocacy that folks will be doing around these issues, and importantly for building coalitions and consensus with other advocates, other individuals, faith communities, and NGOs that are also working to advance religious freedom.
So what you're saying, if they're useful tools for both people to use inside their own country and to reach out to have a coalition of people in other countries.
Exactly, because these are universal standards, so they're applicable across countries and regions.
Great. Well, before we focus on these standards, let's focus on something even more basic. What are the main elements of FoRB, that's freedom of religion or belief? What is it?
Yeah, very, very important question, Judy. So I'll start with sort of some high-level points, and then we'll talk more about this as we go on through these slides. So first, some points on what FoRB, freedom of religion or belief, is. The first and very important points is, as I already touched on, it's a right for everyone. Religious majority, religious minority alike, non-religious people, people dissenting from the majority faith, it is a right for all. It is also an individual human rights. It is a right for people, not religions. So the right holder is the believer and groups of believers as well, communities that are practicing their faith together. But the beliefs is not what are protected. And importantly, religious freedom protects people's right to not be religious. So believer or non-believer, but the rights holder under international human rights law is the person. It also has a number of elements. Many people think religious freedom is limited to worship. It is actually much broader than that. It includes changing one's religion or belief, having no religion or belief, manifesting your religion or belief in various ways, including worship, but also teaching your religion, other rituals, observances, practices, and very importantly, manifesting your religion or belief in public or in private, and alone or in community with others. It also protects the right to religious expression, as said publicly, and that can include religious expression that is intended to persuade someone to voluntarily accept your religious belief. Key word here, voluntarily. It is not completely unlimited, FoRB, but the limitations are narrow and they have to meet standards that are set out in international human rights law. And as described on this slide, it has to be legal, prescribed by law, cannot be discriminatory, and must be necessary to protect certain grounds that are listed in these documents that we're going to talk about. So governments do have some power to limit manifestations of religious freedom, but it's quite contained.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's really important to know what freedom of religion or belief is, especially something that confuses people a lot that you talked about. It's a right of individuals, not religions. And I think a lot of people are confused about that sometimes, and governments sometimes are confused about that.
Yes, that is exactly right.
Yeah. So we've talked about what it is. What is it not?
Yes, that's the flip side of the coin, if you will. So as mentioned, because religious freedom is a right for all, that means it's not only for religious minorities. Now, keep in mind, religious minorities are often ones suffering from religious freedom violations, but they may not be the only ones. There may be people within the religious majority who have somewhat differing views, perhaps from the official, the government's favorite interpretation of religion. So they might be subject to violations, and people within the religious majority equally have a right to religious freedom. It's also important to remember that FoRB is not limited to people of certain religions only. So we do see some situations where governments try to make a distinction between religions that they deem quote unquote traditional versus non-traditional religions, and they treat the exercise, the religious activity of these groups differently. FoRB is a broad right. It protects any and all, people of any and all religious or belief views. So it doesn't, if governments don't sort of get to decide, we view group A, your views as traditional, and therefore you can practice freely. Group B, we don't like your views, you haven't been in our country for a long time, et cetera, and therefore you don't. Everybody gets that right. Similar point, FoRB is not only for citizens of a country, it is for everybody within that country, whether they are a citizen, a resident, or not. So governments can't limit religious freedom rights only to their citizens. Very importantly, in terms of the limitations, many governments cite national security as a ground for limiting religious freedom. That is actually not an accepted ground for limiting religious freedom under international human rights law. There are some other grounds that are, including some that can relate to security, like public order, but national security is not a ground for limiting FoRB. It is a ground for limiting certain other rights, but FoRB is an important important enough right that the international documents have said we're not going to allow it to be limited on grounds of national security. Also, it cannot be limited it can be limited in some circumstances based on public morals, but those public morals need to be broadly held. It cannot be a moral position that is held only by a single religion or only by, you know, sort of a strain of a single religion. It needs to be more universal than that. And these are often things that are understood too. And very importantly, because FoRB is a human right, like every other human right, somebody can't use their human right to remove somebody else's human right. So a person can't exercise their religious freedom in a way that eliminates the religious freedom or any other right of another person.
I think that last one is really important to emphasize, so I thank you for bringing it up. Let's now turn to what are the main international measures that protect freedom of religion or belief. There are 4 of them here. Elizabeth, could you talk about them and talk about what they are? For instance, what's a comment, what's a declaration, covenants, and the UDHR? Thank you.
Absolutely. And these are the 4 most important provisions in the UN space. There are other regional commitments that we're not getting into for purposes of this webinar, for that apply in particular regions, but we're looking at sort of the most universal. The first and oldest one is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And a declaration, so the UDHR and then the 1981 Declaration, those are both declarations of the UN General Assembly, meaning they are documents that were negotiated by governments and then approved by governments. So governments have agreed to them, but they do not have the legal status as a treaty. They do still have influence in international law, and especially the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it is of its age at this point. You know, it is old, and it is so universally agreed to that it really has taken on more importance than a lot of other. There are lots of UN resolutions every year, but the Universal Declaration has sort of taken on a status of its own because it was the earliest statement of these universal human rights principles that was, you know, negotiated and agreed to within the UN system post World War II. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, also negotiated and agreed to by governments, but that is actually a treaty that governments then sign onto. So has more of a binding stature in international law than a declaration. Not every government has agreed to the ICCPR, but most of them have. So, so depending on which country you're looking at, you know, whether you're using the provisions of the ICCPR for your advocacy purposes of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration, you know, will depend on whether the country has signed on to the ICCPR. And as we'll see, the provisions on religious freedom in the Universal Declaration and the International Covenant are virtually the same language. So, you know, the standards are the same. The general comment number 22, that is an interpretation by experts within the UN system. So the way it works is the UN Human Rights Committee is what's called a treaty body. And these treaty bodies are established under the various human rights conventions that make up the International Bill of Rights. So under the ICCPR, the Human Rights Committee is the treaty body that's established to interpret that treaty, the meaning of the provisions, and if a government has accepted a complaints process, which some governments have, not all who are parties to the ICCPR, that Human Rights Committee can adjudicate cases. Somebody can make a claim to the Human Rights Committee that country A has violated Article 18 of the International Covenant, and the committee can hear that case. So and these committees are made up of independent experts who are they're nominated and chosen by governments, but they're independent experts, like the special rapporteurs are for those people who are familiar with the system of special rapporteurs. So this expert body then is charged with interpreting the provisions. One of the ways it does that is through what are called general comments, which are its interpretive explanations. And it's done these over the years on each provision of the ICCPR. So for Article 18, the right to FoRB, the Human Rights Committee's general comment is called general comment number 22. So that's why that is cited within these slides.
Well, thank you for going over these 4 main documents. Let's now turn to how freedom of religion or belief is defined through some of them.
Right. So this here, you're seeing, everybody, the provision of Article 18 from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as you can see here, it builds in the issues that I talked about previously. This is a right for everyone. It's a right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So it's a broad right. Conscience, belief, religion. It expressly says, as mentioned, this right includes the freedom to change your religion or belief, and the freedom alone or in community with others and in public or in private to manifest your religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. So again, this is showing it is a right for everyone of holding any religion or belief, of any religious or belief community, of no religion or belief. All kinds of the points that I went over in the earlier slide. It's a broad right that protects all views, the views of all people, and it's importantly, the manifestation is not only worship, it also observes observance, practice, and teaching.
Great. Okay. So not only observance and worship, that's good to know. So talk a little bit more about some of the other documents like ICCPR.
Sure. So ICCPR in Article 18, it has very similar language to the UDHR. So I won't go over all that again in terms of the everyone and manifestation and the aspects of manifestation, but I do want to point out that there's this provision that expressly provides everyone has a right to be free of coercion. So no one shall be subject to coercion, which would impair your right to have or adopt the religion or belief of your choice. This is very important. And as the general comment, the Human Rights Committee has expressly explained, this means that no government or non-state actor, societal actor, can use threat or physical force or penal sanctions to compel somebody to believe something that they don't. The reason this is very important is because, unfortunately, many countries do violate this provision. There are many countries that have laws that are seeking to compel compliance with certain religious beliefs or to punish the expression of certain beliefs, especially unpopular beliefs. So, for example, many countries have blasphemy laws, which prohibit speech that is critical of religion, viewed of defaming religion or defaming religious gods, religious leaders, etc. So these are really problematic because they're punishing someone and coercing someone not to express certain disfavored beliefs. Unfortunately, these types of laws are quite prevalent. UCIRF is aware of 84 countries that have blasphemy laws currently, and this is in all regions of the world. The enforcement can vary, but they do exist in all regions of the world. Another point about coercion: people shall not be coerced to adopt a religion, or from adopting a religion, a belief of their choice is a better way to say it. So changing religion. Many countries have laws that restrict people from either changing religion or people from expressing their faith in a way that is intended to persuade someone else to change their religion.
Right, and an important thing to focus on, as is non-discrimination.
Absolutely.
Standards talk about that as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's really important too. Very key to remember, as mentioned, this is a right for everyone. And so the right, if government is limiting or trying to limit this right, it can't be discriminatory. So a government can't say, we're going to allow certain groups to practice their religion and not other groups to practice. I sort of touched on this before, a government say, this happens frequently, say Russia does this, for example. Certain religious groups are traditional, therefore they have the freer ability to practice their faith. Other religious groups are deemed non-traditional, therefore we're going to crack down on them more. They're not going to be free to worship or to have their religious meetings or whatever. So that's very important. This is also very important for Women's Alliance, because this also means that women have equal right to religious freedom and to every other right as men. So distinctions that are made in the provision of religious freedom that distinguish based on sex are also problematic.
So UDHR says something about it, and then the 1981 Declaration did as well.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what about equality before the law?
Yeah, no, similar point, meaning that every person has the right to be treated equally by the law, regardless of a number of statuses, including religion, including gender. So as I mentioned, so women have an equal right to FoRB as men, but they also have an equal right to other legal rights. And there's actually in this regard, there are times when, and this draws out the distinction between religion and religious freedom. Religion in many places and cases is used to treat women unequally legally. And sometimes that is done on the basis of, or claimed in the name of religion. So say a woman might have less rights to property. A woman might be subject to guardianship laws, like we see in a country like Saudi Arabia, where basically a woman is treated as a legal minor throughout her life and needs male, her husband or brother or father's permission to do certain things. So that is problematic under an equality before the law provision. But it's also got a religious freedom problem in there too, because as I mentioned, people can't. So sometimes, if a government is claiming that is part of religious freedom to be able to legally discriminate against women, no, it's not, because you can't. The exercise of religious freedom, doesn't allow for this discrimination or similarly for harmful practices against women.
And in fact, a lot of times what's said as a religious dicta is really cultural.
Yes, exactly.
How about parents and children?
Yeah, this is a really important point, and unfortunately one that it's clear in the international standards, but not complied with by some governments. So the ICCPR has, in Article 18, there is a clause that guarantees parents the freedom to ensure the religious and moral upbringing of their children. There's also then this second ICCPR provision that layers in children's protecting children against discrimination on certain grounds, including religion. So this is both very important. The first point on parents having the freedom to ensure the religious and moral upbringing of their children. Unfortunately, we see a number of instances where governments restrict that. An example could be if a government requires religious education in school. In Turkey, for example, there's religious education in school, and it's children who are Christian or Jewish can get exemptions. Children who are Alevi, which is a group that the government deems to be part of Sunni Islam, but many Alevis do not, they can't exempt their children from the classes on Sunni Islam. So that, that's an area where you see it is a problem. And a much bigger problem, of course, unfortunately, among China's many egregious abuses against Uyghur Muslims, the Chinese government has removed an estimated up to 500,000 children from their parents and made them go to government schools where they're being indoctrinated with Communist Party principles and being forced to speak Mandarin instead of the Uyghur language. So the parents and children's rights are very important.
Yeah. Yes. And what about minority rights?
Yes, also very important. So as I mentioned, under Article 18, religious minorities are clearly protected, clearly have FoRB, as does everybody else. But ICCPR has a second provision related to minority rights that sort of reinforces this point, because we do see, unfortunately, many instances where religious minorities are extremely persecuted in many contexts. But this right, it makes clear that for minorities, it is not only about your minority religion, but your minority culture, language, etc. So on this point about sort of that I just made about Uyghur Muslims in China, the language is important too, the culture, sort of minorities have protected rights under international law to continue that culture, convey their culture to their children. So it's really problematic when governments start saying, no, you can't practice your religion, you have to practice it our way. You can't, speak your language, you have to speak the majority language, etc.
Which goes into our next thing, official religions.
Yeah. And this is a common thread that we see. Now, there's no prohibition under international standards on a country having an official religion. Many countries do. Where it becomes problematic is when the official religion is used in a way that violates the human rights of people who are from other religions, or discriminates against them, or non-religious people, right? But violates the rights or discriminates against anybody who doesn't follow that majority religion. We do see that in a number of contexts, although not all. I mean, we put out a report recently looking at government favoritism of official religions and preferred religions, and found that there are 78 countries that have either an official or a favored religion, 40 with favored religions, 40 with official religions, and 38 that sort of have a preferred religion, or sometimes several that they prefer. And it was interesting. Then we looked at laws that then could be used discriminatorily to favor that religion, that preferred religion, or to discriminate against other people. And we found that 57 of the 78 countries had laws like blasphemy laws or other types of laws that could be used to basically enforce or prefer that favored religion to the detriment of the rights of other people. And this again takes us back to many of the threads we've been talking about in our research and in our monitoring of this. Unfortunately, the most frequent ones who experience either rights violations or discrimination in this context where the law is favoring a particular religion are either religious minorities, dissenters within the majority faith, women, or LGBT people. So you see a lot of overlap between the sort of the denial of rights, discrimination, denial of equality before the law, denial of women's rights, kind of all layering on top of each other.
Well, let's go right now to focus more on women and freedom of religion or belief.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a very important point, obviously, to this group and to all of us. So some important things to remember. Women have an equal right to FoRB as men, and women and girls, men and boys. Everybody has an equal right to FoRB. So there can't be distinctions based on gender. And women also have an equal right to other human rights. So that's very important. This is a system of human rights. We're talking about FoRB today. But this is part of a broader system of human rights. So women have rights to FoRB and to equality, and not to be discriminated against based on either their religion or their gender or any other ground that they might fall into, their nationality, their birth, their socioeconomic status, all of those grounds. Another really important point for women in FoRB touches on something, Judy, we talked about before, religion often being used, or religion or culture or tradition, kind of all relatedly, being used as a justification to harm women. And very important to remember that is not a valid manifestation of FoRB. So if somebody is claiming that, forcing women or girls to get married is part of their religious freedom, it's not. It is clear in the international standards, in the interpretations by the Human Rights Committee. This one general comment 28 is from the interpretation regarding the provision on equality rights between men and women. UCIRF has done work on this point, our report on women and religious freedom. It is not a justified use of religious freedom to engage in domestic violence, engage in FGM, engage in forced marriage. I mean, engage in these harmful practices against women's will. That is not, that is not part of religious freedom. And also another point that we really often see with women in FoRB, women's rights to FoRB means freedom of choice with respect to their choice of religion and how they manifest that religion. And in particular, we see lots of violations around religious dress for women, where you either have governments like Iran and Saudi Arabia who force all women to wear a certain form of religious dress, regardless of whether those women individually would choose to wear that dress. And then conversely, you see France, where they forbid women from wearing certain forms of religious dress, regardless of whether a woman has voluntarily chosen to wear that dress. So on both sides of that coin, it's problematic from a FoRB perspective.
Yeah. Well, you've given us a lot of information, and I encourage folks to go to UCIRF's annual report and other of UCIRF's publication for more information. Elizabeth, as we end this webinar, what do you want to emphasize to people?
Yeah, I think for this audience, especially for the advocates working in this space, just to reiterate what I said at the beginning, that the importance of understanding these standards and using these standards is because these do represent consensus positions in the international space, negotiated in the UN system, agreed to, and in some cases a treaty even signed on to by governments. So these are universal. They're not specific to one country or religion. Governments that have signed on to the ICCPR, those are treaty rights. So you should use that in advocacy with that government to say you are violating the rights that you have accepted to guarantee to your people. You should use your knowledge of these rights when you're providing information or seeking redress from international bodies. Like if it's a country that you can go to before the Human Rights Committee and file a claim for, if you're writing a letter to a UN special rapporteur raising concerns about something, if you're seeking, if you're providing information to a government that's promoting FoRB, like the US government, the UK government, governments within the IRFPA, the International Alliance of Freedom of Religion or Belief. And also, it's important for your media advocacy and for your coalition building between, with other actors who are working in this space, whether they're faith groups, whether they're secular human rights groups, across a range of sectors and across a range of countries and regions.
Well, thank you so much. You've given us a lot of information. If people have any questions, they can contact me at jgolub@forbwomen.org or Elizabeth at ecassidy@ucirf.gov. And obviously this webinar will be posted on FoRB Women's sites. I want to thank Elizabeth Cassidy again for teaching us so many important things and the importance of international standards. So thank you and have a good day.
Thanks, Judy.
This session is now concluded.